Welcome to Conversations with the Experts. My guest today is Chris Fenton. He's a media executive, a producer, an author, and someone with a vast amount of experience in the China market. Chris, because of all of that experience, is an advisor to the U.S. Select Committee on China Relations. He's a member of the U.S. Asia Foreign Council. He knows a lot about working with China and certainly a lot about media. Well, I wanted to talk today, Chris, about media, and perhaps one of the things I heard you say earlier was where people get their news here in the United States and about both opportunities and perhaps risks associated with China. So if you could enlighten us on that, please.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on here, Dan, and it's a great network that you guys have put together. One thing I wanted to do before we started here was just to talk about the fact that there is a lot of doomsday perspective about when it comes to the bilateral relationship and how it's moving forward. I'm working on some keynotes for some upcoming engagements. And one of the things that I really want to press upon is that there are true opportunities if you create products and services that could have access to that market or do have access to that market. The key now, though, is to keep that speculation or the scrutiny of the United States government off of you so that you're not curbed as far as what your engagement is there. So, one of the things that I really impress upon people is to think about patriotism before capitalism, really put national security interests and national security priorities ahead of whatever capitalistic endeavor you have in terms of that market. Now, in terms of the way Beijing looks at what you're doing, always think about the fact that they're trying to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And they have serious supply chain issues and serious scarcity issues there. So, what we're providing to that market is needed, but you need to think about placating certain priorities that they have over there while also balancing what you have going on in the United States and those interests that you have to protect too. So, there are opportunities, and I don't want to be a doomsdayer today. But if you're talking about where we are moving forward, we do have a serious strategic decoupling that's going on between the two countries. However, there are various choke points that are involved with both. We've talked earlier, Dan, before this interview about TikTok being one of those, and we can address that and talk about some of those other choke points that are creating serious problems between these negotiations that both Trump and Xi are trying to have.
What is the issue with TikTok? I think you told me remarkably we had both houses of Congress, the executive, and the Supreme Court all on the same side of the issue, kind of a rare event recently.
Yeah, well, it's unbelievable what's going on right now because you do have the TikTok issue being almost a unanimous consensus between all branches of government that it needs to be either deplatformed here in the US or exchange complete control and ownership. I worked with the select committee on that progress towards the bill that hit the House that almost passed completely unanimously, both sides of the aisle, then went to the Senate, then went to the executive branch, and then was upheld in the Supreme Court. I also wrote an op-ed that was one of the most widely read ones in Real Clear Politics back in January of last year, leading into that. It's an incredible situation where we're seeing essentially the president discount all of the approvals and all of the law around trying to get this negotiation between China and the US figured out in terms of the ownership and control of TikTok. I think what he's doing is using TikTok and various other ingredients to the supply chain of China and the priorities of Beijing in terms of trying to find some leverage in overall trade negotiations. Because, quite frankly, China has the upper hand. They have the upper hand because of Sumerian cobalt magnets, because of rare earths, because of various other magnets that are derived from rare earths, and the fact that they have the full choke point for essentially our automobile industry and for our military. I mean, our F-35s use 50 pounds in each F-35 of Sumerian cobalt magnets. So he knows that we have a national security issue there and we have a major industry issue in terms of one of the key choke points that China has. And TikTok may be a lever to help alleviate that leverage and give some to the side of the US.
What is exactly the risk with TikTok? I read a lot about them getting data, but I think when we talked earlier, You said that was a relatively small problem.
TikTok has been talked about a lot in terms of like the way data is stored, right? So there's been a talk about this Texas plan to get the data from Americans stored here that is derived from the use of TikTok's platform. But the fact is, the data is really a minor issue in the way I look at it, and the way the select committee looked at it, and the way various intelligence agencies look at it. The real problem is propaganda. And what we showed with the select committee to the various entities that needed to sign off on that bill was this massive amplification of things that divide the country and this massive throttling of things that unite us or talk about certain narratives that Beijing wants to hide or disguise in terms of a global message. So when you look at the fact that people under 35, almost 40% of them get all of their news and information from TikTok, and the fact that those people under 35 in 5 years are going to be 40, and then in 5 years after that are going to be 45, you're realizing that the news and information that they're digesting and making policy decisions on someday, or even making everyday consumer or citizen decisions on, or elective decisions on, are going to be completely controlled by Beijing and the Ministry of Propaganda inside of Beijing's arsenal.
They are, in your opinion, far more of a risk than our own social media platforms.
Well, our own social media platforms aren't owned and controlled necessarily. I mean, maybe there's money involved, but they're not owned and controlled by one of our four adversaries, right? There's four adversaries as designated by Washington, D.C. and our U.S. government. Those are Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. Imagine if TikTok was a North Korean platform or a Russian platform or an Iranian platform. Would we allow it to have the access to people under 35 here the way we allow China have access to the people under 35? And also think about it that Beijing itself does not allow its own 1.4 billion people to have access to the TikTok that we digest here on a daily basis. They have their own platform called Douyin, and Douyin actually promotes and amplifies things that benefit society in China and benefit the system that Beijing has created there. There's nothing nefarious, pernicious, or wacky or showing stunts that are against the system or against the law or any of the other things that influence our kids, influencing kids in China because they just simply don't have access to the same TikTok platform we do here.
That's remarkable. On the one hand, we have this sort of risk or challenge. On the other hand, you talked about the rare earths and the cobalt magnets. Don't we have rare earths here? How did we get in this situation where we're solely dependent or so massively dependent on China in that area?
Well, it's interesting. I think Beijing played a really good game of chess and we played a good game of checkers. They outsmarted us when it came to understanding the importance of rare earths and the rare earths derivatives, such as the magnets that we need in the auto and military industrial complex. They were smart, and we knew we had an issue with this dating back to 2010, yet we did nothing about it, mainly because of pressures coming from Beijing and where they were trying to put our emphasis and priorities when it came to getting access to their market. So, in a best case scenario, we might be able to near shore refining of rare earths that we might be able to get here or in allied countries somewhere around 2028 or 29. But in the meantime, China has the upper hand. They have that chokehold. And if you combine that with the fact that we're depleting our resources when it comes to both the Russian Ukraine conflict and the Israeli Iranian conflict, and the fact that we need to replenish those resources with supply chain materials that we don't have access to, you start to see a real opportunity for Beijing to possibly, as they call reunification, that activity happen in terms of Taiwan. And there might be nothing that we can do about that.
It seems like there is a combination of risk and opportunity. And it seems to me that they've been playing the game and we haven't quite yet known that there's actually conflict going on. And what you're suggesting is a way for us to plan with the things that we do well and realize what their actual agenda is.
Yeah, the big or the superpower that Beijing has is the ability to plan on, say, 10, 25, 50, 100-year horizons. They're not beholden to shareholder disputes or problems with investors on, say, 24-hour news cycles, or even every 2 years election cycles, or things that move and disrupt different markets or industries, et cetera. They're really planning for the future, and they have these long-term plans. We plan essentially day to day, hour to hour. So we have a real problem and a weakness when it comes to that and strategy. But what I will say is that the glue that will keep us from kinetic conflict is culture and commerce. It's not national security, it's not politics, it's not human rights. It's culture and commerce. They like our culture, they want to digest it. They like our products, they believe they're premium. We just need to think smarter about how we contain and keep national interests as a priority here in the US, while we still try to maintain a very healthy and long-term health sort of beneficial trade policy with that country, because it is that trade that's going to keep us away from war.
This has been a very interesting conversation, Chris. I think, as you said, thinking long term is going to be a challenge for us, but I think the trade and communications and the culture is what we should concentrate on. Thank you very much for this discussion. I can see perhaps coming back with more. I've really learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Dan.